Boudica, the legendary British queen who took on the Romans and came within a whisker of possibly freeing Britain from their rule. However, did you know she burned 3 towns to the ground, killing everyone inside, possibly up to 70,000 men, women and children, and many of those who died were her own countrymen living in those towns. Her final battle with the Romans resulted in a massacre of thousands of her warriors and their families, and thanks to her revolt, many more Britons died in an ensuing famine. So, was she really a freedom fighter, or with that record of indiscriminate slaughter, simply a psychopath? I'm Chris Green, the History Chap, telling stories that bring British history to life. So, what is it about Boudica that somehow fascinates and resonates with us nearly 2,000 years later? It's time to uncover the real story of Boudica, the warrior queen of ancient Britain. In a previous episode, I told you about the Roman invasion of Britain in AD 43. The Roman victory at the Battle of Medway, and along with Vespasian's lightning campaign in the southwest of Britain, had shocked the British tribes. Any form of resistance evaporated, and Roman rule was rapidly extended through the south and Midlands of what's now England. Many tribes or kingdoms, such as the Iceni in East Anglia and the Brigantes in the north of what is now England, saw which way the wind was blowing and offered the Romans support. As client kingdoms, they were allowed to get on with things pretty much as they had done before, with limited Roman intervention. The only real resistance the Romans were facing was coming from the west. And it was coming from a leader who we met in my previous episode, Caractacus. He and his brother had led the alliance of British troops that had been defeated at the Battle of Medway. Caractacus fled westwards to modern-day Wales, where he led the resistance struggle, first commanding the Silures in the south, and then the Ordovices. Finally, in AD 50, he was defeated and fled to the most powerful tribe in the north of England, the Brigantes. Unfortunately for him, the Brigantes were led by a pro-Roman queen, Cartimandua, who handed him over to the invaders. Cartimandua has a fascinating little story, which includes fighting a civil war with her husband and then running off with his servant. I mean, it's like something out of the Jerry Springer show, and maybe I should tell it another time. The defeated Caractacus was paraded in Rome and then brought before Emperor Claudius. In a passionate speech, he asked Claudius what he would have done if their roles had been reversed. Claudius spared his life, and Caractacus lived out the rest of his days in Rome, and then disappeared from history. So how does Boudica fit into all of this? Well, by AD 60, a new Roman governor had arrived in Britannia, Suetonius Paulinus. And he's going to be central to our story of Boudica. An experienced military commander, used to the harsh frontiers of the Roman Empire, he was the first Roman to cross the Atlas Mountains in North Africa during a successful campaign in what was called Mauritania, modern-day Morocco. Arriving in Britain in AD 58, he was determined to enhance his military reputation still further, as well as extending Roman rule. And for the next 2 years, he used his experience of mountain fighting to drive through North Wales. His campaign brought him to the narrow strip of water which separated the mainland from the island of Anglesey, also known as Inns Mons. For Suetonius, the island was one last obstacle that needed to be crushed. And apart from being the home to dissidents who still opposed Roman rule, it was also the centre of the Druid religion that had provided an inspiration not only to British resistance, but also resistance in Gaul, modern-day France. Using flat-bottomed boats, he moved his infantry across the Menai Strait. Meanwhile, the cavalry used fords and swam with their horses. On reaching the far shoreline, his army were met by a terrifying sight. Roman historian Tacitus leaves us a dramatic picture of what faced them. Fierce warriors, bare-chested and covered in woad tattoos, women with wild hair and carrying torches running amongst them, druids uttering curses and holding hands upwards to the heavens. Even the experienced and disciplined Roman soldiers hesitated at the sight, until their commander rode forward and urged them on, scorning that they were afraid of the women. Tacitus also paints a vivid picture of the savage destruction that the Roman army wrought. Slaying anyone in their path, they made their way to the sacred woodland groves of the Druids, which they proceeded to cut down. It was a symbolic as well as straightforward military victory. But right at this moment of victory, the pinnacle of his career, Suetonius was brought the alarming news that 300 miles to the south, a major revolt had erupted. It was led by Boudica, Queen of the Iceni. Now, despite all their military prowess, the traditional way that the Romans controlled their huge empire was by governing through local elites, who were convinced that being Romanised was a good thing. However, their approach in Britain had been heavy-handed and started to alienate even these friendly rulers. As an example, in AD 47, they ordered these friendly tribes to disarm. Several refused and rose in revolt, including the Iceni. The revolts were swiftly crushed, but this merely increased the animosity, even with their potential allies. To the south of the Iceni were the lands of the Trinovantes in modern-day Essex. The Roman invasion had in theory liberated them from their overbearing neighbours, the Cativalorni, led by Caractacus and his brother. So, if any tribe should welcome Roman rule, it should have been them. But once more, heavy-handed Roman policies alienated them. A colony for retired Roman soldiers was established at their old capital at Colchester. Here the Roman settlers encroached on lands held by locals, took many into slavery, and certainly did not behave in a way that would convince the population that Roman rule was something to be admired and copied. By AD 60, it was the biggest settlement in Britain, bigger even than the newly established trading centre of Londinium. This heavy-handed approach was exemplified by the provisional procurator, Decius Catus. The procurator was responsible for collecting taxes, rents, and other monies deemed to be Rome's. Now, tax collectors have never been popular in any culture at any time in history, and Roman procurators were no exception. But it seems that even Romans thought that this particular man was overzealous in his approach. With Suetonius Paulinus campaigning 300 miles away in northwest Wales, Decius Catus was effectively in charge of the south, and he was carrying out his tasks with glee. And it was now that the king of the Iceni died. He left behind 2 daughters as his heirs, and a widow, Boudica. In an attempt to preserve his daughters' inheritance, whether as rulers or as merely well-positioned nobles, the king had named the Emperor Nero as co-heir with his daughters. It was an established way for aristocrats across the empire to keep their families and wealth safe from disputes. Yet basically, if you challenged his daughter's inheritance, you were effectively challenging the emperor's too. And woe betide you. Which worked, unless you were dealing with Procurator Decius Catus. He declared the king's will invalid and that all his lands passed to the emperor, and on the emperor's behalf, he now plundered the royal houses and went further by evicting nobles from their lands and acquiring them for Rome. When she tried to oppose his excesses, Boudica was flogged and both daughters raped. It was the last straw for the Iceni. The Iceni were enraged and rose in rebellion behind their queen. We don't know much about Boudica's background. We don't know where she came from, how old she was, or even how her name was pronounced or spelt. Nor can historians agree whether her revolt was in 60 AD or 61 AD, because various timelines don't perfectly match up. But what we do know, thanks to Roman writers, in particular Tacitus and Dio, was what happened next. Boudica and her Iceni were joined by other tribes, including the Trinovantes, and went on an orgy of destruction that threatened to bring Roman rule in Britain to an end. And before we go on to find out how Boudica tried to free Britain and terrorise many of her own Britons living in Roman towns, I just want to thank recent supporters Eric, Harry and Aid. If you like my work, then please do join my community. There's a link on how to support the show in the description. Let's get back to Boudica. The incensed rebels descended on the Roman colony at Colchester. At this time, Colchester was probably the most populated town in Britain, even ahead of the fledgling port of London, with a population of somewhere between 10 and 12,000 people. Despite the suddenness of the revolt, it seems that the attack wasn't altogether a shock. There seems to have been enough concern that something was up for the inhabitants of Colchester to send word to the procurator requesting military assistance. When the procurator finally responded, his assistance was not exactly top drawer. 200 semi-armed men arrived to assist the former legionnaires face the British revolt. The Romans later claimed a fifth column of British servants, etc. inside Colchester, confused Roman inhabitants and prevented any serious defence. Maybe that's true, and after all, they had good reason. Some soldiers fled to the temple and held out for 2 days, but it was no good against that vengeful army of Britons. They and everyone else in the settlement were massacred. The victorious Britons now advanced on London. En route, they were met by a force under the commander of the 9th Legion, marching south from Lincoln. This was not the full legion, but just a detachment, and was completely outnumbered by Boudica's army. They were cut to pieces, with only the commander and his cavalry managing to get away. Boudica's march on London, or Londinium to give it its Roman name, continued. Procurator Decianus Catus, the man whose heavy-handed approach to the Iceni had done so much to ignite the revolt, now fled across the channel to Gaul, never to return. Governor Suetonius Paulinus was made of sterner stuff, and rode hard to London with a bodyguard, leaving his army marching as fast as possible back from Anglesey. With the 9th Legion defeated and London denuded of troops, he decided that the only option was to regroup elsewhere. He ordered anyone fit or able enough to follow him north, and off he went. So, what if you weren't fit or didn't have the means of transport to follow him? Well, you were on your own, and many were. With no defensive fortifications, no soldiers, few weapons, and let's face it, if they weren't fit enough to follow the governor, they weren't fit enough to fight either. They were butchered by Boudica's warriors. Archaeological evidence has revealed a thick layer of ash covering the ground in Londinium from this time. There's further evidence that the rebels crossed London Bridge and continued their attacks on the south side of the river too. Now Boudica turned north and sacked the town of Verulanium, modern-day St. Albans. Tacitus claimed that 70,000 Romans and friends of Rome died in this revolt. Whilst Tacitus' numbers here and elsewhere in the revolt need to be taken with a pinch of salt, we know that Colchester, a town of 10,000 to 12,000 inhabitants, had not been evacuated. Based upon that, the death toll from there, Londinium and Verulanium must have been in the thousands. And before you think the Romans had it coming to them, just pause for a moment. The dead were not just Romans. Let's do the maths. We know from Tacitus that Suetonius' army, when it finally met Boudica, was 10,000 strong. We also know there was a legion of roughly 4,000 men down in Exeter, and an under-strength legion at Lincoln. So maybe 16,000 Roman soldiers in Britain, and most of them were still alive at this stage of the revolt, and would remain so. So somehow, in 17 years of occupation, 70,000 Roman civilians had settled in Britannia. That is very unlikely. Even 300 years later, it's estimated that out of a population of 3.5 million on the island, only about 125,000 were Roman soldiers and their families. So, apart from some Roman traders and officials, you come to the shocking realisation that the vast majority of Boudica's victims were fellow Britons who'd embraced the Roman Empire. And indeed, Tacitus specifically writes about Romans and friends of Rome as victims. With 3 of the most important Roman settlements burned to the ground, Boudica now advanced up Watling Street to meet Suetonius and his army. It would be a make-or-break battle. The future of Britain hung in the balance. Meanwhile, Suetonius Paulinus had rendezvoused with his army, retracing their steps from North Wales. Consisting of the whole of the 14th Legion, detachments of the 12th and auxiliaries, his army numbered 10,000. Missing were the 2nd Legion, whose commander refused to move from Exeter despite being ordered to do so. Knowing, just like Boudica, that this battle would be decisive, he chose his ground carefully and waited for the coming storm. The site of the Battle of Watling Street has never accurately been identified, but most historians believe it to be in the vicinity of Atherstone, situated on Watling Street, just to the east of modern-day Birmingham. Others suggest it might still have been adjacent to Watling Street, but slightly further east, near Hinckley, where Watling Street was crossed by another major road, the Fosse Way. The latter ran from Exeter to Lincoln, and would make sense if the Roman governor was trying to bring the legions from both those bases to join him, which it so happens they didn't. The governor drew up his troops in close order, in a defile that opened onto a plain in front of him. His position was protected in the rear by a dense forest. Auxiliaries positioned on the flanks, and then cavalry were on the wings. It was a strong position, Slightly elevated, with its sides and rear protected, it forced Boudica to fight on a narrow front where her enormous numbers would not particularly benefit her. According to Roman historian Dio, who was writing nearly 100 years after the events, Boudica's army was 230,000 strong. Most historians think that whilst this is inflated, the Britons did massively outnumber the 10,000 Romans. Boudica arrived and she positioned her army across the plain facing her enemy. And then in her chariot with her daughters, she rode from tribe to tribe. In a stirring speech she shouted, "I am one woman from the crowd seeking retribution lost, for body beaten, for daughter's purity violated." And then she upped the stakes by declaring it a do-or-die battle. "We should either win on that field or perish." And then cuttingly, "This is a woman's intention. You men may survive, enslaved." It was very Elizabeth I addressing her troops at Tilbury before the Spanish Armada. And interestingly, Boudica was indeed used as a symbol of a female queen resisting foreign invasion during the reign of the Virgin Queen. Behind her army was a large semicircle of wagons and chariots loaded with wives and families, here to see the great victory. Meanwhile, with this vast army facing him, and I know the numbers are suspect, but the Romans were most certainly outnumbered, the Roman commander was also trying to inspire his troops. In something reminiscent of Henry V's Band of Brothers speech, he said, "Even among many legions, it's a few that really decide the battle, and it will enhance their glory that a small force should earn the renown of an entire army." Did he or Boudica ever make those speeches? Well, Tacitus claims so, but then they are very eloquent, aren't they? On the other hand, his father-in-law was on the general's staff at this battle, so maybe his account is more accurate than we give him credit for. Whatever was really said, the Britons were inspired enough to charge. With their war cries, thousands upon thousands swarmed uphill towards the Roman lines. The Romans met them in an unnerving silence. And then at 40 yards, they let fly with a hail of javelins. The unarmoured Britons, many not even wearing tops at all, were easy targets. That javelin assault momentarily halted the Britons' advance. The Romans now moved forward in disciplined wedge formations, whilst the cavalry, armed with their lances, swept in from the wings. Trapped in a crush, the Britons were unable to bring their large double-handed swords to bear. And despite their numbers, the Britons were no match for the disciplined Roman army, and started to fall back. However, they now found their line of retreat blocked by their own wagons containing their families. The battle turned into a massacre, with Tacitus quoting 80,000 British men, women and children killed, as against 400 Roman dead. Boudica seems to have escaped from the battle, but committed suicide by taking poison shortly afterwards. Well, that is Tacitus' account. Dio, who, don't forget, was writing nearly a century later, claimed that she died from an illness. Her burial place is not known, although the legend that she lies under platform 10 at King's Cross Station is fun, but likely to be a 20th century invention. Another person to die shortly after the battle was the commander of the 2nd Legion, who had stayed put in Exeter, having both refused his general's order and denying his men the glory of victory on the field. He committed suicide. Reinforced by 2,000 legionnaires from Germany, plus cavalry and more auxiliaries, Suetonius now turned his vengeance on any tribe who had supported the revolt, or indeed who had stayed neutral. Homes were burned, warriors killed, men, women and children enslaved, and his wrath extended far from East Anglia, the heartland of the rebellion, reaching all the way to Somerset. Many more Britons succumbed to famine as they'd not sown crops as they joined the Great Revolt. However, military power could not deflect from the fact that the revolt had arisen because local British elites had been alienated by Roman policies. A new provisional procurator was sent to replace the disappearing Decianus Catus. He adopted a softer approach to tax collecting, and his stance was reinforced when a new governor replaced Suetonius. Whether it was this conciliatory approach or the devastation wreaked by Suetonius is open to question, but the fact is that the southern part of Britain never again rose in revolt for the rest of the 350 years that Britannia was a province of the Roman Empire. Colchester, Verulanium, and Londinium were rebuilt. But whilst the south of the island never rose against Rome again, that wasn't the case in the north. Within 10 years, Cartimageon's estranged husband, Venutius, would lead the Brigantes in another, much less remembered uprising that lasted a lot longer than Boudica's. But that, as they say, is a story for another day. Boudica has come to symbolise Britain's fight for justice and freedom. But it was in the Victorian period that Boudica, or Boadicea as they preferred to call her, took on her legendary status, fighting for justice and for British freedom. She was lionised by the poet laureate Alfred Lord Tennyson, and most famously in Thomas Thornycroft's statue by Westminster Bridge in London. Positioned there opposite the Houses of Parliament in 1902, Boudica, resplendent in her chariot with swords on the hubs and her daughters alongside her, is a beacon of British nationhood and independence. So it's somewhat ironic that Boudica appealed so much to the Victorians, seeing as they saw themselves as the new Roman Empire spreading universal order, language and peace across the 19th century world. And rather like the Romans with regard to Boudica, the Victorians didn't actually take kindly to any opposition. So why is she remembered? Boudica, the freedom fighter, who inspired thousands to rise against Roman rule. And if she'd defeated Suetonius at the Battle of Watling Street, what could have prevented her freeing Britain from Roman rule? The Legion at Exeter and the Understrength Legion at Lincoln? And a victory would surely have inspired other tribes to rise too. Interestingly, despite his troops' ultimate victory, Emperor Nero was so shaken by this revolt that he contemplated abandoning the province. Yet for all her ferocity, her victories were against civilian targets, apart from that brush with the detachment from the 9th Legion. When her huge army finally met a Roman army in full battle, she was comprehensively defeated. She led thousands of her warriors and their families to death. But they died trying to free their lands from foreign rule, as did Boudica. Rather than being paraded through Rome like Caractacus, she chose to poison herself. What better form of defiant, bloody-minded British up-yours statement to Emperor Nero? Although Boudica meeting Nero would have been an interesting moment, wouldn't it? Boudica, the British freedom fighter, a female warrior in a man's world. Although there is an alternative, less palatable thought. Those 70,000 people her warriors killed. Accepting that less than 1,000 were Roman soldiers, and that just 17 years into the occupation there must have been relatively few Roman civilians on the island, you can't help coming to the conclusion that the vast majority of those butchered were fellow Britons, men, women and children. And what with leading her army and their families into a massacre that cost the lives of thousands, and being so absorbed in her revolt of revenge that she allowed followers to join her and not tend their crops, the question has to be asked. Boudica, was she a freedom fighter or a psychopath? I'll let you decide. British history is full of amazing characters, some we haven't heard of, others are not quite the people we were taught about at school. For instance, the highwayman Dick Turpin, the romantic, dashing king of the road as seen in films, television and even songs. In fact, he was far from any of those things. So check out the video I recently made that tells the real story of Dick Turpin. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to please support the show by clicking the link. Until next time, keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.